I always said that my house was too quiet, but I never imagined that silence hid so much. At the age of 69, I learned to live with loneliness as someone who learns to live with an old pain. It doesn't disappear, it just settles down. That morning, I woke up like so many others, prepared my coffee, sat by the window and watched the world go by without noticing me. Nothing indicated that this would be the day my life would begin to fall apart, or perhaps, reveal itself. I decided to drag the sideboard in the living room to clean in the back, something I had been putting off for months. The furniture was heavy, and my hands no longer had the strength they had before, but I insisted. When I finally managed to move it a few inches away from the wall, something fell to the floor with a dry, almost timid sound. I lowered it slowly, feeling my back complain, and it was then that I saw the yellowed, folded, clearly old envelope, with my name written in official letters. My heart raced in a strange way, as if I already knew that this letter was not just paper. I recognized the symbol in the corner of the envelope, I recognized the type of correspondence. It was one of those that never arrived by chance. My hands trembled as I held her, and a sense of invasion washed over me. That letter was not there by carelessness. It had been hidden. I sat on the couch before I even opened it, trying to organize my thoughts. I have always been a simple woman, but I have never been foolish. For years, I trusted that my daughter took care of things for me, said that it was for my good, that I didn't have to worry. I believed it. I believed because I wanted to believe. Because it was easier than admitting that maybe I was being pushed out of my own life. When I finally opened the letter, I felt the floor disappear. It was a formal notification, with expired dates, ignored deadlines, decisions made in my name. My name was there, my signature mentioned, but I didn't remember anything about it. She had not been consulted. I had not been warned. The letter screamed what my routine had been whispering for months: something was being decided without me. The sense of betrayal came as a slow, deep punch. It wasn't anger yet, it was something worse. It was the pain of realizing that someone I trusted thought I didn't need to know things anymore. That I didn't deserve explanations. That my age had turned me, in her eyes, into someone incapable. I felt ashamed, not for myself, but for having allowed it without question. I began to remember all the times I asked about letters that never arrived, about bills I didn't see, about papers that quickly disappeared from the table. She always had a ready answer, a calm smile, a tone of exaggerated patience. "Mom, leave it to me," she would say. And I let him. Now, that sentence echoed like a sentence. I looked around the room, my living room, my house, and everything looked different. As if the walls had heard conversations that I didn't hear, as if the furniture were accomplices of secrets that excluded me. For the first time, I felt afraid of what I didn't know yet. If one letter had escaped, how many others would never reach my hands? I folded the paper carefully, even with my heart in pieces. I still didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. Something had been broken inside me. It was not just a hidden correspondence. It was my autonomy, my dignity, my history being rewritten without my consent. At that moment, I understood that my life was about to change. Not because I wanted to, but because the truth had found a way to escape. A single letter was enough to show me that the greatest danger was not in my age, nor in loneliness, but in blindly trusting those who claimed to protect me. And I silently promised myself that this would be the last time anyone would decide for me without me knowing. The fact that you're here, listening to this story so far, says a lot about who you are. What comes next isn't just something I've lived, it's a truth that many people carry in silence, about trust, family, and boundaries. If you believe that stories like this need to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel, because this support is what keeps alive narratives that, deep down, are about all of us. After finding that letter, I spent the rest of the day walking around the house as if I were a visitor. Each object seemed out of place, not because it had changed, but because I no longer saw them in the same way. The feeling was that my life had continued to happen without me, like a movie from which I had been taken out of the main script. I tried to take a deep breath, but the air always seemed too short. I spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the folded letter in front of me, as if she could explain to me on her own everything I didn't yet understand. My head hurt, not from confusion, but from too much clarity. I began to piece together small memories that had previously seemed harmless, but now formed a frighteningly coherent drawing. The pieces have always been there. I just didn't want to fit them in. I remembered the medical appointments that my daughter started to schedule without asking me, the telephone conversations she attended for me, saying that I was resting. I remembered the times when the postman rang the doorbell and it appeared too quickly, as if it was waiting for it. At the time, I thought it was careful. Now, it sounded like surveillance. I have always been an independent woman. I worked, raised children, faced losses, buried my husband with the dignity I could muster. It wasn't fair that I was suddenly treated as someone incapable of understanding life itself. But I allowed it, little by little, because fatigue also teaches you to give in. And giving in is sometimes costly. The most painful thing was not to realize the control, but to recognize my own silent participation. I convinced myself that it was normal to be left out, that getting older meant giving up decisions. It was easier to accept this than to face the possibility of conflict with my own daughter. Love, I realized too late, can also leave us vulnerable. As I thought, I began to wonder how many other decisions had been made without me knowing. How many signatures mentioned on papers that I have never seen? How many missed deadlines? How many choices made by me, but not by me? The letter wasn't the beginning of anything, it was just the first concrete proof of something that had been going on for a long time. I felt a silent shame, the one that is not shared with anyone. Shame for having trusted without question, for having accepted vague explanations, for having diminished myself to fit into the fragile version they created of me. It wasn't public humiliation, it was something more intimate, deeper, as if my authority over myself had been stolen. I looked at my hands, scarred by time, and thought of everything they had ever done. They signed contracts, held children, made difficult decisions. It was not possible that they were now considered incapable. That realization ignited something inside me, still weak, but alive. A contained, silent, but firm indignation. I decided that I needed to observe more and talk less. If they had decided things for me for so long, it was because they believed I wouldn't understand. That would be, from that moment on, my greatest advantage. I still didn't know how to act, but I knew I needed to understand the size of it before taking any false step. That night, I went to bed with my eyes open for hours. I didn't cry. The crying would come later. What I felt was something different, a slow, almost imperceptible, but definitive change. I was still the same woman as always, but I was no longer the same person who had woken up that morning. Something had awakened, and I knew I wouldn't go back to sleep anytime soon. The next day, I woke up with the strange feeling of being watched, even though I was alone. The sun came in through the window as always, but I no longer felt welcomed by the routine. Everything seemed too rehearsed, as if my life had become a stage where I was no longer the protagonist. I stood up slowly, trying to act naturally, even with my head full of questions that I still didn't dare to ask out loud. When my daughter arrived later, she brought that same quiet smile that she always showed to others. A smile of someone who seems patient, dedicated, almost heroic. She asked if I had slept well, if I needed anything, and spoke to me in that too calm tone, as if I was too fragile for normal conversations. I replied that everything was fine, and for the first time I realized how much that answer seemed to please her. I watched her every gesture more closely than ever. The way he organized papers quickly when I approached, how he answered the phone and moved a few steps away, how he was always in a hurry to close matters involving money or documents. All this I used to call efficiency. Now, it looked like staging. A well-trained staging, repeated for years. The most painful thing was to know that, outside that house, she was admired. Neighbors commented on how lucky I was to have such a present daughter. They said that not everyone had this blessing. I smiled, I agreed, because I didn't want to look ungrateful. Who would believe me if I said that, behind all that care, there was something suffocating, controlling and silent? I realized that my image had also been molded for others. I was always presented as confused, tired, forgotten. Small comments played lightly, almost as a joke, but that little by little were building a version of me that I barely recognized. It wasn't a direct accusation, it was worse, it was a narrative being created without me being able to correct it. As she was talking on the phone that morning, I heard my name mentioned followed by an exaggerated sigh. I didn't hear the rest of the conversation, but I didn't have to. I already knew that tone. It was the tone of someone who carries too heavy a burden, the burden of taking care of his own mother. A role she seemed to play proudly in front of others. I felt a mixture of sadness and anger, but it was not yet time to confront. I needed to understand how far it went. If she was able to hide letters, what else would she be capable of? How many decisions had already been justified in my name, without me even knowing they existed? Doubt began to erode my confidence like a silent termite. During lunch, I noticed how she chose my words for me. When someone asked something, she answered before I could open my mouth. I kept silent. Not out of fear, but out of strategy. For the first time, I decided that observing would be more important than reacting. I let her believe that everything was still under control. Meanwhile, inside, something changed. I no longer saw myself as that dependent woman that everyone seemed to see. I knew who I was. I knew what I was capable of throughout my life. And that certainty, still shy, began to strengthen inside me like a root breaking through the hard ground. That night, I closed the door to my room and sat on the bed in silence. I thought about how many times I confused love with obedience, care with control. For the first time, I allowed myself to think that maybe my daughter wasn't just a dedicated caregiver. Perhaps she was also someone who benefited from my silence. I still didn't have enough evidence, but I had something equally important, the awareness that I wasn't crazy, weak, or confused. I was being underestimated. And that, ironically, could be my biggest advantage. Because those who are not seen as a threat are usually ignored. And I was beginning to understand how to use this to my advantage. The next morning, I woke up with a silent decision already made within me. I wouldn't ask anything anymore. Questions alert, awaken defenses, make those who hide something act more carefully. Instead, I began to observe details that I had previously ignored. The time the mailman would pass, the sound of the mailbox being opened, the exact time between the doorbell ringing and my daughter showing up at the door. Everything began to take on a new meaning. I noticed that I rarely got my hands on the mail myself. There was always an excuse: I was busy, resting, or I didn't have to worry about it. I started to feel a physical discomfort when I remembered how many times I accepted this without question. It wasn't just convenience. It was exclusion. And it had been practiced in such a subtle way that I had helped to normalize it myself. I started digging through old drawers, forgotten boxes, folders I hadn't opened in years. He did not do it in a desperate way, but methodically, as someone looking for something knowing that he will find it. In the midst of old papers, I found empty envelopes, torn in a hurry, without dates, without content. My stomach turned. That was no coincidence. Each empty envelope was a silent confirmation that the letter I found behind the furniture was not alone. There was a pattern, a habit, one system. And the cruelest thing was to realize that this system only worked because I trusted it. Because I believed that no one would do that to me, much less my own daughter. I started to remember specific moments when something seemed out of place. A charge that I never understood, a benefit that stopped coming without explanation, a legal consultation that never happened, despite having been resolved. Everything had been resolved, yes. Just not for me. With each memory, the feeling of betrayal deepened. I felt a lump in my throat at the thought that important decisions about my life may have been made while I was watering plants, making coffee, or sleeping in the afternoon. I was physically present, but absent from what really mattered. It was as if they had built a parallel version of my life, one where I had no voice. The hardest thing was to accept that this didn't start suddenly. It was not an isolated mistake. It was a slow, calculated process, sustained by small gestures of care. Each hidden letter was another brick raised between me and the truth. And I only realized when the wall was almost ready. At one point, I felt like crying. Not of sadness, but of mourning. I fight for the woman I was, for the trust one gave without reservation, for the time that does not come back. But I swallowed my tears. It was not yet time to break down in tears. I needed to keep a cool head. Too much emotion could make me make a mistake. I spent the night sitting in bed, with some papers scattered around me. They were not evidence yet, but they were indications. And clues, when they accumulate, tell entire stories. For the first time, I didn't just feel like a victim. I felt like I was gathering ammunition, even though I didn't know exactly when I was going to use it. I understood, in that heavy silence, that the truth always finds a way to escape. A letter escaped. Others left traces. And if I had been underestimated for so long, perhaps this was precisely what would allow me to see what no one imagined I would see. I still didn't have all the answers, but now I had something I would never lose: attention. It took me a few days to realize that the control was not only in the papers and letters. He was also absent. People who were once part of my routine simply stopped showing up, and I accepted this as something natural, as if time had done its job of driving everyone away. Only now have I begun to understand that time did not act alone. I noticed that the phone rang less and less. When I asked about an old friend, my daughter replied matter-of-factly that she had called, but I was resting. Another time, she said that I didn't seem willing to have visitors. I didn't remember saying that, but I doubted myself. Doubt, I realized, was a powerful tool in the hands of those who wanted to control me. I began to observe how my image was presented to others. Always as someone tired, confused, too sensitive. Small phrases, said with a worried smile, that were accumulating in the heads of those who listened. It wasn't a direct lie, it was a constant distortion. Gradually, I stopped being seen as Beatrice and became the mother you need to take care of. I started to notice different looks from the neighbors. An excessive care, a discreet pity, as if I could collapse at any moment. That hurt me more than any screaming. I wasn't sick. I was not lost. But they were convincing others, and almost myself, that I was. I remembered a time when I tried to make an appointment with an old coworker and received an evasive answer. "Your daughter said you haven't been feeling well." At the time, I thought it was strange, but I let it go. Now, that memory has come back as a clear accusation. I was being carefully isolated, like someone who closes doors without making noise. Loneliness, which I used to attribute to age and widowhood, has gained another name: strategy. It was easier to decide for me if I had no one to talk to. It was simpler to shape a narrative if no one could confront it. The realization of this gave me a chill down my spine. It wasn't just financial or legal control. It was emotional. I felt anger, but also a deep sadness. Not because I was alone, but because I was pushed into this loneliness without realizing it. My world was shrinking as I believed I was just getting older. In fact, they were reducing my space, my voices, my choices. Even so, something inside me began to resist. The isolation that was supposed to weaken me was, paradoxically, making me more attentive. Without distractions, I began to think clearly, observing patterns, connecting dots that once seemed too far apart to form a complete picture. I decided I needed to break that silent circle. He still didn't know how, or with whom, but he knew he needed someone outside that house. Someone who was not under the influence of the version they had created of me. This decision, taken in silence, was a small act of rebellion that gave me back a thread of strength. That night, before going to sleep, I stared at the dark ceiling and thought that isolation only works as long as the person believes they deserve to be isolated. And I didn't deserve it. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I was not only resisting what was done to me, but slowly beginning to prepare myself to react. It was on a seemingly ordinary afternoon that I realized that this wasn't just about control, it was about risk. While my daughter was organizing some papers on the living room table, I noticed a different envelope, with a letterhead that gave me an immediate shiver. She tried to hide it too quickly, like someone who turns off a light when caught. It pretended to be natural, but I had seen enough to know that something serious was approaching. I waited for her to leave for the room and, with my heart racing, discreetly searched for the papers that had been left behind. I did not find the envelope, but I found notes, numbers, names of lawyers, loose words such as interdiction, power of attorney, and evaluation. My whole body tensed. That was no longer a supposition. It was a plan in progress. I sat slowly, feeling my legs fail. The thought of losing my home, the place where I built my entire life, hit me like a blow to the chest. It wasn't just a ceiling. It was my history, my memories, my last space of autonomy. And someone was preparing to take it away from me, using my own age as justification. The cruelest thing was to realize that everything was being done under the guise of care. If one were to look from the outside, one would see only a dutiful daughter, concerned for her mother's safety. No one would see the woman who was being pushed out of her own decisions, little by little, until there was nothing left but obedience. I began to live with a constant but silent fear. Fear of waking up one day and finding out that I could no longer decide anything. Fear of being declared incapable without ever having been heard. Fear that my word no longer had any weight. It was a fear that did not scream, but corroded. At the same time, something unexpected began to grow inside me. A cold lucidity. If there was a plan, he would leave traces. If they were preparing legally, there were documents, deadlines, procedures. I didn't need to be an expert. He just needed not to be invisible. And for the first time, I decided I wouldn't be. I started writing everything down in a hidden notebook. Dates, conversations, phrases said with apparent carelessness. I didn't know exactly how I would use it, but I knew I needed to register it. That gave me a strange feeling of control, as if I was, finally, holding one end of the wire they were trying to pull away from me. I started to measure my words more carefully, appearing fragile when convenient, agreeing when he disagreed. It was not submission. It was strategy. If years had been spent underestimating me, I wouldn't squander that advantage now. I let them believe that I was still oblivious. At night, lying in bed, I thought about how I got to that point. I never imagined that getting older would mean having to defend myself from my own children. That saddened me deeply, but it also strengthened me. Because, if I had survived so many losses, it would not be now that I would give everything without a fight. I understood, at that moment, that the threat was not future, it was already underway. And if I didn't act, my life would be decided in meetings that I wouldn't even know existed. I closed my eyes with a new and firm certainty. No one would take away what was mine without me being heard. Even if I had to learn, on my own, to scream the right way. It was on a simple morning, while I was watering the plants in front of the house, that I realized that someone was watching me in a different way. It was not pity, nor curiosity. It was attention. Mrs. Margaret, my neighbor of a few years, was leaning against the gate, pretending to arrange a bag, but clearly waiting for the right moment to talk to me. I always thought she was too discreet to meddle in other people's lives, which made that gesture seem even more meaningful. She commented something banal about the weather, then about the garden, until she lowered her voice and said that she missed me on afternoon walks. That phrase, so simple, hit me hard. I didn't walk anymore because my daughter said I didn't walk well. I didn't remember saying that to anyone. It was the first time that someone from the outside confirmed that something was wrong. Donna Margaret made no accusations, did not raise direct suspicions. He only commented that the postman used to leave mail with me before, and that now he always delivered everything directly to my daughter. He said this as if commenting on the weather, but his eyes said something else. It was a warning. A silent care coming from someone who had nothing to gain from it. I felt a tightness in my chest, followed by unexpected relief. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had noticed. Someone had seen the changes, the patterns, the details that it took me so long to see myself. That realization gave me back something I didn't even know I had lost: confidence in my own perception. I invited her in, something I hadn't done in a long time. As we had coffee, she told me that she had experienced something similar to a sister years before. He spoke carefully, without dramatizing, but he made it clear that control disguised as care can be dangerous. His words did not sound like advice, but like a warning from those who already knew the way. When I mentioned, still vaguely, the letter I found, I saw her countenance change. Not by surprise, but by confirmation. She told me, with calm firmness, that this was not normal and that I needed guidance. No mercy. Orientation. That word echoed in my head like a door that opened. She told me about a well-known lawyer in the neighborhood, someone used to dealing with issues of the elderly and complicated families. He didn't insist, he didn't press. He just wrote down his name on a piece of paper and handed it to me, as if passing on something precious. In that simple gesture, I felt an alliance being formed. After she left, I sat at the table for a long time, staring at that paper. It was just a name, a phone number, but it represented something much bigger: the possibility of getting out of isolation. For the first time, I was not alone in that silent struggle. There was someone who didn't see me as fragile, but as someone who needed to be heard. I felt afraid, of course. Seeking help meant crossing a line of no return. It meant admitting that my own daughter might be harming me. But at the same time, I felt a new courage, still shaky, but real. The courage that is born when the truth begins to be shared. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my apron pocket, close to my body, as if I needed to feel it was there. I still didn't know when I would call, or how I would do it without arousing suspicion. But I knew that this meeting had changed everything. From that moment on, my story was no longer a secret kept only within me. That night, before going to sleep, I thought that maybe strength doesn't come from grand gestures, but from small connections at the right time. An attentive neighbor. An apparently ordinary conversation. A name written on a piece of paper. Sometimes, that's how life gives us a chance to turn the tide. And I was ready to grab mine. I spent 2 whole days with that folded paper hidden in my coat pocket, as if it weighed more than it really did. Every time I touched it, I felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. Fear of what I might discover, hope that there was still time to stop what they were planning against me. I had never been a woman of impulses, and I knew that this step had to be taken carefully. I chose to call when my daughter left to solve important things, as she used to say without ever explaining it properly. I waited to hear the sound of the car driving away before closing the bedroom door and picking up the phone. My hands were shaking so much that I had to prop the device on the table. I took a few deep breaths, as if I were about to cross an invisible abyss. When the call was answered, my voice came out firmer than I expected. I didn't tell you everything at once. He only said that he needed guidance, that he was suspicious of decisions being made without my consent. On the other end of the line, I heard something I hadn't heard in a long time: respect. There was no rush, no judgment, no condescending tone that I was already used to receiving. We scheduled a discreet meeting for the following week. Nothing flashy, nothing that could arouse suspicion. I hung up the phone with my heart racing, but with a new feeling in my chest. I had taken the first step out of fear. Small, quiet, but definitive. From that moment on, I was no longer just someone reacting. I was acting. I spent the rest of the day in a state of alert. Every noise seemed louder, every movement more meaningful. When my daughter returned, I watched her face with redoubled attention, looking for signs of distrust. I didn't find anything. She was still sure of herself, comfortable in the role she had been playing for years. That overconfidence made me even more sure that I needed to continue pretending normalcy. In the evening, I sat down at the table with my notebook hidden and added new notes. Dates, times, small lines that I would have forgotten before. Writing helped me organize not only the facts, but also my feelings. I needed to maintain clarity. Too much emotion could make me falter, and I couldn't afford that. I realized that, little by little, something inside me was changing. I was still afraid, but it no longer paralyzed me. It was a fear that kept me alert, that pushed me forward instead of making me retreat. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was regaining parts of myself that had been left behind. I also felt guilty. Guilt for distrusting her own daughter, for imagining such harsh scenarios. But this guilt began to lose strength in the face of the evidence. I learned, in that enforced silence, that the truth doesn't disappear just because it hurts. To ignore it would be much crueler to myself. That week, I began to mentally rehearse what I would say at the meeting. I didn't want to look confused or exaggerated. I wanted to be clear, objective, owner of my story. Each rehearsal reinforced something important. I knew exactly what was happening. And knowing this gave me a strength that I hadn't felt in years. When I lay down that night, I realized that I slept better than I had in the previous weeks. Not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped pretending that everything was fine. Sometimes, facing the truth is less tiring than living trying to ignore it. And I knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. On the day of the meeting, I left the house with my heart racing, but with a firm posture. I told my daughter that I needed to solve something personal and I didn't give any more details. She stared at me for a few seconds longer than usual, as if trying to read something on my face, but I kept a neutral expression. I learned that sometimes silence is the best armor. The lawyer's office was simple, without luxury, but organized in a way that conveyed security. As soon as I sat down, I realized that no one treated me as someone fragile or confused. He called me by name, listened carefully and asked me to tell everything from the beginning, at my own pace. That respectful listening gave me the strength to continue. As I spoke, I realized how much my story made sense outside of my head. The hidden cards, the isolation, the decisions made without my consent, all connected together like pieces of a cruel puzzle. The lawyer did not show exaggerated surprise, he just confirmed something I feared. It was more common than I imagined, and also more serious. He calmly explained to me the legal weight of intercepted correspondence, documents signed without authorization, attempts at interdiction based on fragile narratives. Each explanation was like a reality check, but also like a thread of hope. There were laws that protected me. There were possible paths. I was not helpless. When I showed him the notes in my notebook, I saw his look change. There was not only emotion there was method. Dates, times, patterns. That made it clear that I was attentive, conscious, and perfectly capable of understanding my own situation. For the first time, I felt proud of myself in that whole process. I left the office with a list of guidelines and a clear request to gather everything that could serve as evidence. Old correspondence, bank records, messages, anything that showed that decisions were being made without my knowledge. The truth needed support, not just indignation. I came home different. No longer just suspicious, but informed. And information is a powerful form of freedom. I started to look at every corner of the house with different eyes, as if I were revisiting a territory that had always been mine, but from which I had been gradually removed. In the following days, I found more than I expected. Documents stored in unlikely places, copies of papers I never remembered seeing, torn envelopes. Each discovery hurt, but also strengthened. Betrayal ceased to be a diffuse sensation and gained clear, concrete, undeniable contours. I realized that my daughter had built an entire narrative without me. A narrative in which I was incapable, confused, dependent. And the more evidence I found, the clearer it became that it was not protection. It was convenience. It was control. It was treason. At times, I had to stop to breathe. The pain of recognizing all that came in waves. But I didn't allow myself to back down. I hadn't come so far to pretend again that nothing was happening. Each paper found was one more step out of that shadow. That night, I sat at the table with everything spread out before me. I didn't cry. I felt something different, a cold, firm assurance that the truth was on my side. And for the first time since it all began, I realized that the game had changed. I was no longer just someone reacting to a plan. I was prepared to face him. In the following days, I noticed a subtle change in my daughter's behavior. She began to observe me more, to ask questions she hadn't asked before, to show a restlessness that she tried to hide behind the same calm smile. It was as if he felt that something had changed, even though he didn't know exactly what. And it had changed. I was no longer predictable. She began to insist on knowing where I went, who I was talking to, why I needed to go out alone. The questions came disguised as concern, but they carried a new, almost urgent tone. I answered little, always with vague phrases, and that seemed to make her even more uncomfortable. For the first time, control was not entirely in her hands. I also noticed that the papers began to disappear from places where they used to be abandoned. Drawers started to be locked, folders moved around, conversations interrupted when I approached. The attempt to hide stopped being careful and became hasty. He who does not fear, does not hurry. One afternoon, she sat in front of me with a heavy sigh and said she was worried about me. He said that I seemed different, more distant, more suspicious. She said that I needed to rest more, that maybe I was getting confused. Hearing that, knowing what I knew, was like taking a hard hit. It was not a concern. It was a clear attempt to delegitimize me. I felt the anger rise, but I held it tightly. It was not the time to explode. I calmly replied that I was fine, that I just wanted to take care of some things by myself. Her gaze hardened for a second, too fast for anyone who wasn't paying attention. There, I saw the mask slip. She began to use guilt as a weapon. She commented on how tired she was, how much she sacrificed her own life for me, how difficult it was to take care of someone in my situation. Each sentence was calculated to make me retreat, to push me back to the place of dependence. But something in me no longer accepted that. I began to notice how she spoke about me to others, always in front of me, but as if I was not there. Small observations about my memory, my health, my decision-making capacity. All with a sweet, almost affectionate tone. It was a silent exhibition, a preparation of the ground for what she intended to do. At the same time, I felt something curious. The more she tried to diminish me, the clearer the truth became. Whoever acts like this has something to lose. And I knew exactly what she was trying to protect. The narrative he built was beginning to crack. That night, I locked myself in my room and reread my notes. Each sentence of hers now had a different meaning. Each attempt at control was further proof of what was happening. I no longer just felt betrayed. I felt determined. I realized that fear had changed sides. Before, I lived in fear of what they could do to me. Now, it was she who seemed to fear what I might discover, prove, expose. This silent inversion gave me unexpected strength. Lying in bed, I thought the mask doesn't fall off all at once. It cracks first, in small, almost imperceptible fissures. But when that happens, there's no way to glue it back on. And I knew that I was getting closer and closer to the moment when she would have to face me without disguise. This part that comes now is the hardest to share, because by telling it, I relived choices that cost me relationships, silence, and sleepless nights. Exposing this moment means giving up the protection of the unsaid and accepting the weight of the truth as it is. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that certain stories only survive when someone has the courage to say them out loud. Therefore, I ask you, sign up, not as support, but as a gesture of preservation, so that voices like mine are not swallowed up by silence. The next morning, I woke up with strange, almost uncomfortable clarity. It was no longer the confusion of feelings that accompanied me in the first discoveries. It was as if something had organized itself inside me during the night. For the first time, I didn't just feel like I was reacting to events, but consciously choosing how I was going to face them. I passed in front of the mirror and watched myself carefully. I saw an older woman, yes, marked by time, but I also saw firmness in her eyes. I thought about how I spent years allowing others to define who I was at that point in my life. Fragile, tired, dependent. That image was never entirely true, but I accepted it because it was easier than fighting it. Throughout the day, I noticed how my daughter continued to act as if everything was under control. She spoke, organized, decided. And I let him. Not by submission, but by calculation. Every time I kept quiet, she felt safer. Every time I agreed to something small, she believed that I was still in the same place as always. This false tranquility was exactly what I needed. Within me, however, the change was profound. I no longer felt ashamed for being suspicious, nor guilt for protecting myself. I understood that there was a huge difference between loving someone and allowing them to cancel you out. Loving does not require absolute silence. Love shouldn't mean losing one's voice. I started to plan carefully. I thought about what to say, what to keep, what I still needed to discover. There was no more room for impulses. Every step needed to be firm, because now I knew that any mistake could be used against me. The woman everyone thought I was would make no mistake, and I would use this expectation to my advantage. I felt, for the first time, something very close to pride. Pride for not having gone crazy, for not having given up, for not having let myself be convinced that I was imagining things. Proud to be facing one of the most difficult pains anyone can face, the betrayal of a child. I also felt sadness, but it no longer dominated me. Sadness was now accompanied by lucidity. I no longer romanticized the past, nor did I idealize who my daughter was. I saw the situation as it really was, without filters, without excuses. That hurt, but it freed. I realized that, for a long time, I was invisible because I let myself be invisible. Because I thought that getting older meant getting smaller. Now, I understood that experience is also strength. That silence, when used well, can be a strategy. That no one suspects the woman they believe to be defeated. That day, I did something simple but symbolic. I organized my own documents, put everything in a folder of my own, which no one else would have access to. As I did this, I felt as if I was rearranging my identity as well. Each role was a reminder that I existed, that I had history, rights, choices. In the evening, I wrote in my notebook something I never thought I would write: I'm not weak. I'm being tested. That sentence stayed there, looking back at me, like a silent agreement with myself. I hadn't won yet, but I wasn't lost either. I understood, finally, that the woman no one saw was waking up. And when someone underestimated decides to take action, the impact is usually much greater. I didn't need to scream, or accuse, or beg. I just needed to keep going. And I would continue. In the days that followed, silence ceased to be just an absence of words and became a conscious choice. I spoke less, but thought more. My every gesture was calculated, every answer was measured in the exact tone so as not to arouse suspicion. It was strange to realize how the simple act of not reacting confused more than any direct confrontation. My daughter seemed more and more restless. I tried to resume old conversations, remember moments of union, as if I wanted to rescue a version of me that no longer existed. I listened, nodded, but inside I remained distant. It wasn't coldness. It was protection. I needed to keep my mind clear to what was to come. I started to leave the house more, always with simple excuses that are difficult to question. A trip to the market, a short walk, a quick visit. Each exit was, in fact, a rehearsal of independence. I felt the weight of her gaze on my back, but I also felt something new, pleasure in not explaining everything. The final meeting with the lawyer was approaching, and I was preparing myself emotionally for it. He knew that, from that moment on, there would be no return. Bringing everything to the surface meant exposing wounds that might never heal. But it also meant stopping bleeding in silence. At times, doubt still tried to reach me. Thoughts such as, what if I'm exaggerating, or what if this destroys everything, appeared, insistent. But it was enough to remember the hidden letters, the documents, the attempts to paint me as incapable, for these doubts to lose strength. The reality was too harsh to ignore. I began to realize that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is acting in spite of it. I was still afraid, very afraid. But he no longer paralyzed me. He walked with me, like a shadow, but I went on anyway. One afternoon, while organizing my things, my daughter commented that it might be good to think of alternatives for the future. The tone was soft, but the intention was clear. I smiled slightly and said I was already thinking about it. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't know what I was thinking, and it destabilized her. I felt a pang of sadness that everything had come to that point. I never imagined that I would need to defend myself from those I created. But I also felt something like relief. The truth, even painful, is less burdensome than the lies sustained for years. That night, I hardly slept. Not out of anxiety, but out of expectation. I knew the confrontation was approaching, even if there was no date set yet. And, contrary to what I imagined at first, I didn't feel small in the face of it. I felt prepared. I looked at the dark ceiling and thought about how many women, like me, grow old believing that they have lost the right to decide. I promised myself that no matter what, I would never again accept the role they tried to impose on me. Silence had fulfilled its role. Now, he was about to turn into a voice. The day of the confrontation arrived without announcement, as moments that change an entire life usually come. There were no screams, no slammed doors, no dramatic scenes right from the start. There was only one request from me, firm and direct, for my daughter to sit with me at the living room table. She was surprised by my tone, but obeyed, still confident that she was still in control of the situation. I put the papers in front of us calmly. I didn't throw anything, I didn't accuse, I didn't raise my voice. I just organized the tests one by one, like someone putting together a puzzle that is impossible to ignore. Open letters, torn envelopes, copies of documents, notes with dates and names. The silence that settled in was heavy, almost suffocating. She tried to smile at first, made nervous jokes, said I was confusing things. But as I spoke, clearly and precisely, the smile faded. For the first time, she didn't have a ready answer. Every attempt to interrupt me was contained by the logical sequence of events. I wasn't venting. I was exposing. When I mentioned the lawyer, I saw her face turn pale. It was there that the mask fell for good. Her voice changed, it became harsher, more defensive. I said that everything had been done for my good, that I no longer understood how the world worked, that someone needed to take control. Hearing that, said without disguise, was painful, but also liberating. I listened to it until the end. Not out of submission, but because I wanted to hear the whole truth. When she finished, I took a deep breath and said something simple but definitive. I hadn't authorized any of that. He said that care does not give the right to steal choices, nor to erase someone from one's own life. He said that love is not built with lies. She got excited, accused me of ingratitude, of selfishness, of destroying her own family. The words came as low blows, calculated to hurt me. In another time, I would have retreated. At that moment, I remained seated, with my hands firmly on the table. I no longer needed her approval to exist. I talked about the legal consequences, the evidence gathered, what was about to happen if it wasn't stopped immediately. I didn't threaten. I just informed him. The confrontation is no longer just emotional and has become real, concrete, inevitable. There, for the first time, she realized that she had lost control of the situation. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was no longer an imposed silence, but a silence of defeat. I saw in her eyes something I had never seen before, fear. Fear of being exposed, of losing what she had planned, of having to answer for her actions. That image was engraved in me. I got up slowly and said that this was not revenge. It was limit. It was survival. He said I wasn't destroying anything, I was rebuilding. That conversation didn't fix our relationship, nor could it. But it changed the dynamic between us forever. When I went up to the room that night, my legs were shaking, but my conscience was clear. I had said everything that needed to be said. I had placed myself entirely in front of the truth, without hiding. The confrontation did not give me back complete peace, but it gave me back something much greater, respect for myself. I went to bed with a heavy heart, yes, but also with a solid certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again. And for the first time since it all began, it didn't scare me. On the contrary. It was exactly what needed to happen so that I could finally move on. The days following the confrontation were eerily quiet. Not that oppressive silence of before, but a heavy silence, loaded with consequences. My daughter began to walk around the house like a stranger, avoiding my eyes, answering what was necessary, measuring every word. The security she displayed was gone, replaced by a tense caution that made it clear, the game had changed. I felt the impact of what I did in waves. There were moments of relief, almost euphoria, for finally having broken the cycle. And there were moments of deep pain, when the weight of the rupture became too real. It was not easy to accept that the person I raised now looked at me as someone who faced her, not as a mother. The truth takes its toll, and it is rarely light. I started to receive calls that did not reach me before. Old friends, neighbors, people who had been kept at a distance began to reappear. Some showed support, others curiosity. I spoke little, just enough. I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. Those who needed to hear the truth had already heard it. The tension culminated in practical decisions. Papers were reviewed, authorizations cancelled, limits clearly established. Each signature of mine, now conscious, seemed like a gesture of resumption. I felt tired, yes, but it was a different tiredness, the tiredness of those who fought, not those who were pushed. There was a difficult conversation in which my daughter tried, for the last time, to reverse the roles. She said that I was exaggerating, that I was being influenced, that it would destroy any chance of reconciliation. I listened to her in silence and replied with something simple: there was no reconciliation possible without truth, and the truth could no longer be untrue. I realized that winning does not mean coming out unscathed. I lost illusions, I lost a relationship as I believed it was, I lost the naive tranquility of before. But I gained something that has no substitute: clarity. Knowing exactly where I am, who I can count on, and, above all, who I am. Some nights were still difficult. Loneliness, now more conscious, hurt more at certain times. But it was no longer accompanied by confusion or shame. It was a clean, honest solitude that allowed me to think, feel, and decide without interference. I started to organize small plans for the future. Nothing grandiose. Simple things, but mine. A different routine, activities that I had put aside, choices that previously seemed out of my reach. Each little shot was a way of reaffirming that my life went on, despite the scars. I understood that the truth does not reconstruct everything that breaks. It does not give back time, it does not erase wounds, it does not repair relationships by itself, but it prevents new lies from accumulating. And that, in itself, is already a form of liberation. At that time, I accepted that I would not come out of this winning story in the traditional sense. There was no applause, no easy happy endings. There were consequences. There was distance. There was pain. But there was also dignity. And that, for me, was non-negotiable. When I looked in the mirror one morning, I saw someone tired but whole. I didn't know exactly what the future would be like, but I knew it would be mine. The price of truth had been high, but continuing to live in the lie would have cost much more. When everything finally calmed down, I realized that freedom doesn't come with fireworks. She arrives silently, almost shyly, like someone who knocks on the door not knowing if she will be welcomed. I was free, yes, but I was also different. There was no euphoria, no feeling of absolute victory. There was something deeper, the awareness that I had survived something that could have erased me completely. My house is truly mine again. Not just on paper, but in feeling. Each room seemed to breathe with me, as if it had also been set free. I started to circulate through it with another look, another rhythm. There was no longer a rush to please, nor fear of bothering. It was my space, my story, and I finally felt authorized to occupy them entirely. The relationship with my daughter has become something distant, almost protocol. There was no sincere request for forgiveness, no real attempt at reconstruction. There was silence, wounded pride, and a minimum coexistence, loaded with caution. It hurt to accept that. It still hurts. But I learned that not every wound closes as we would like, and that insisting can be just another way to hurt yourself. I started to make small decisions that once seemed too big. I chose my own schedules, my appointments, my commitments. I resumed old conversations, rekindled ties that had been weakened without me noticing. I didn't go back to who I was before, and I didn't want to. That woman was too accepting. This one knows where it ends. Some people started to look at me with surprise, as if they didn't expect that firmness coming from me. Others showed respect, perhaps even admiration. I didn't need it, but I confess that it was comforting. For a long time, I was seen as someone too fragile to decide. Now, my mere presence said otherwise. There were nights when I cried alone, remembering what I lost. Not only from the relationship with my daughter, but from the illusion that love always protects. These tears were not tears of weakness. They were in mourning. I mourn for the mother I thought I could still be, for the family I imagined I had. Crying, I learned, is also a way of saying goodbye. Over time, I began to feel something new grow inside me. It was not complete happiness, but peace. A peace built with limits, with conscious choices, with the certainty that no one else would decide for me in secret. I could live with the consequences, because they were mine. I started to talk more when I needed to, and to be silent only when I chose. This difference changed everything. He was no longer afraid of looking difficult, nor of displeasing him. The dignity I regained was worth more than any approval. I had learned, perhaps late, but definitively. Today, when I look back, I see that a single letter changed the course of my life. Not because it brought pain already existed, but because it brought truth. And the truth, even when it destroys, also builds. It took me out of one place of submission and put me in another, more solitary, perhaps, but infinitely more honest. I move on without perfect endings, without easy reconciliations, without promises of eternal happiness. I move forward with something better, awareness, autonomy, and respect for myself. I am free, yes. But I'm free knowing exactly what it cost. And this freedom, conquered and not granted, no one will ever take away from me. If this story has touched you on any level, sharing this video can go far beyond a simple click. What has been experienced here reflects silent patterns that are repeated in many families, in many homes, every day. By sending this to someone who needs to listen, you turn sharing into an act of solidarity, because sometimes, seeing a story is the first step to breaking a cycle. I'll stay here, reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city and country you are watching, and what of this story has stayed with you. Your words really matter to me.